So Matthew, my question for you is, I know your organization specializes in developing economic forecasting models. So what are you forecasting for this year? And more importantly, what do you think about the quality of the growth that you're looking forward to?
One of the things I want to sort of highlight real quick before we jump into data is that, what a remarkable moment this is in time. If I think back 1 year ago, we were sort of at this important threshold where, February 17th of 2021, the vaccine was being rolled out to high risk patients in the population. It was just about to be made available to the general population. I got my vaccine 10 days after the last event. And so it was sort of a moment in time where, where there was hope, but it was just hope. We didn't know what this new thing was. Those of us who weren't working in the industry didn't know what this thing was. We hoped that it would hold the promise, to bring, hope back to the pandemic. And now 1 year later, we're sort of sitting at a very different threshold, which is we've had 2 additional waves of disease since then. But the reality is the vaccines have just done unimaginably well in protecting folks. Now, in terms of where we're at with the economy and the threshold we're at now, seeing a potential end, or not necessarily an end of the pandemic, but at least learning to live with COVID and what that means for the economy. What's funny is that the actual growth figures, it's almost one of the funny things about the last 2 years is that many economic numbers have almost ceased to have meaning, right? 5.7%, what is that? Yeah. We saw 31.2% decline on an annualized basis in economic activity in 2020, the largest quarterly decline ever recorded. We had the following quarter, 33.8% annualized growth rate, the largest growth ever recorded after that. And so the numbers almost cease to have meaning. In terms of 5.7%, that sounds pretty good. It's not quite as good as the 7.2% from 1984 coming out of the Volcker recession of 1982. But it's certainly been a good year. The reality is that generally speaking, economic growth, there's an idea in macroeconomics called the plucking theory that in many ways the economy is like a string. The harder you pull down on a guitar string, the more rapidly it springs back. And so generally speaking, the deeper the recession, the more robust the growth coming out of it. And that was certainly true coming out of the 1982 recession. We had 4.6% in 83, 7% in 84, over 4% in 85. And so we would have expected a really big annual growth number this year. But the reality is, this pandemic hasn't quite taken the trajectory some of us thought in that there's been these subsequent waves. The economy has started to open, and then we've had to necessarily scale back some of that. And so that 5.7%, I don't think represents sort of the economic weight of the moment and what we avoided. And the vaccines played a big part of that. I also want to point out, and hopefully we'll have, we can have some back and forth on what I see as sort of the economic issues of the moment, right? So in some ways, the vaccines made, just avoided the worst outcomes for lives, but in many ways, they also helped us avoid the worst outcomes for livelihoods by allowing economies to reopen. But a lot of the policy responses to the pandemic are actually going to be with us for years to come. Inflation is the economic issue of the moment, the highest inflation in 42 years. Real weekly wages declined 3.1% in the last year. So that's to say, again, this is pay is declining, right? Incomes are declining as a result of, in real terms, as a result of the inflation. And then the other thing we did is we took on this extraordinary debt as a result of the pandemic, and there's sort of a dark underside to that for the economy, which is that our long-term growth outlook is substantially lower as a result of that debt. We expect that to crowd out private economic activity. And unfortunately, lower growth in the long run means less economic opportunity, less economic mobility. And so that's to say greater income inequality. Now, this is an issue we actually talked about a year ago when we were meeting. Because at that time, what we were highlighting a year ago was that The pandemic, in many ways, increased inequality in the nation because the experience of individuals varied quite a bit by socioeconomic status. If you were, sort of what Joel Kotkin calls the laptop classes, right? The people who were able to, in jobs and roles that supported remote work arrangements, the pandemic was a lot easier for those folks. And they didn't experience the displacement that, that jobs that didn't support remote worker relationships suffered. And so we were seeing inequality last year as a result of the pandemic, and now we expect increased inequality as a result of the economics, right? The economic policy responses will increase inequality in the years ahead.